Olá, Tutameia está ao vivo, transmitindo diretamente dos nossos estúdios domésticos com a Eleonora.
O Rodolfo.
E do outro lado da tela, do outro lado do Atlântico, conversa conosco desde a Grã-Bretanha, Lex, ativista do Defend All Juries, que a Eleonora agora apresenta como manda o figurino e inicia a entrevista deste início de tarde aqui no Brasil, meio de tarde em Londres. Eleonora.
Lex, thank you so much for joining us. I will present in Portuguese, and then I will ask you some the questions. The first question. Lex Cort é da ONG Defenda, Proteja Nossos Jurados, Defenda Our Juries, é a porta-voz, né, desse grupo que está se destacando, vem se destacando na defesa do direito de manifestação, né, em defesa dos palestinos, da causa palestina. Na Grã-Bretanha, uma importante organização de defesa da Palestina, Palestine for Actions, a Ação pela Palestina foi considerada, apontada como uma organização terrorista, e isso caiu na sexta-feira passada, na Alta Corte de Justiça britânica, e é sobre isso que a gente vai falar aqui com a Lex Cort. Lex, thank you again. I would like to begin asking you, how is the struggle to defend the Palestine cause? We heard that there is an important movement last week. What can you tell us about the struggle of the liberty of speech and the defense of the Palestinians?
So I think really what this whole issue is about, it's about corruption and the lack of democracy. And that's where Defend Our Juries found its place, because that's what we were highlighting. We were highlighting that the general public, we have a conscience, and our conscience does not match with what our governments are currently doing. And what our governments are currently doing is they're in bed with, whether it's the arms companies, whether it's the oil industry, whether it's big tech companies. That is not what the general public want. The general public know that democracy isn't working currently. And that's where we then see this use of legislation. In the case of Palestine Action, that legislation, particularly now terrorism legislation and those terrorism powers, are being weaponized as a tool of oppression, as a tool of silencing anyone who goes against those corporate interests. And that's what we saw in the UK. We saw, not only in this kind of Palestine movement, it happened before with the Kurdish movement, but now that it happened with Palestine Action, and it was the first ever domestic protest group in the UK that ended up being targeted with terrorism legislation, it really shook our country's core and what people believed that law was there for. And we came to the realization, which many people had been saying already for years, that the law is not protecting the people, the law is protecting property. And that is what we realized as kind of communities started coming together and took action to lift the ban on Palestine Action.
Why do you use the word corruption to speak about the government, especially in this case?
I think in this case, the word corruption really highlights how our government, there are some sort of processes which are somewhat transparent. Our government in the UK specifically has to acknowledge any money or any meetings that they have with different corporate interests, different corporations, insurance companies, banks, and so on. And a lot of that is actually registered on our government websites. If you then go into reading the policies and the bits of legislation that our politicians put through, you can see that it's not the legislation that they got the votes of the regular people when they were voted in, but it is the legislation that was discussed in private meetings with, whether it was Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli weapons company, whether it was Allianz, an insurance company that insures a lot of Israeli interest and assets, whether it's ExxonMobil or BP, big multinational oil and gas companies. So this is kind of what we're then seeing, is that it is corruption. It is not the promises that our politicians were elected on. It is what they were later on told in private meetings with the additional kind of cash flow into politics. And that's why we talk about corruption.
Mm-hmm. And do you think this is what moves the government, or moved the government to use the terrorist law against a group that is like has been doing it has been doing peaceful demonstrations and speak their minds? I mean, this is the reason that. What's the reason that they use this terrorist law against this group?
I think in the kind of bigger picture, it was about a fear tactic. It was the label of terrorism is something that in, Western countries, when we speak about terrorism, we think of, an attack on civil population that was done with some sort of, what we start thinking of like a scary ideology. So there was part of that kind of public narrative that they wanted to control. If you can label someone a terrorist, generally the public will be on your side, whatever you do to them. However, what happened in this one was that because they tried to label someone a terrorist who had been so open about what their actual aims were, Palestine Action's aims at no point were to harm or threaten any person. Their only tactics were around property damage specifically with corporations and financial institutions that were financing or conducting the genocide of the Palestinian people. And, the use of these terrorism powers in the UK specifically, the law on terrorism, if a group is prescribed, it gives the courts and the police excessive powers, not only around financial kind of, you cannot get funding for a group that is a prescribed organization, but also other people who necessarily were not part of that organization will not be able to say anything supportive of that group. So you're basically silencing a whole huge part of society who would have supported, not necessarily, themselves taken action with Palestine Action. We know that the amount of people who actually took action with Palestine Action was around in the thousands. It was never around 100,000. But now people know what they did and what they wanted to do. It actually massively backfired on the government. And now Palestine Action is a household name. Everyone in the UK knows what Palestine Action is. And the kind of excessive use of those terrorism laws definitely kind of worked not to silence Palestine Action, but it brought people more into this space where people were actually more angry rather than scared of the terrorism legislation. And that meant that they weren't silent. They actually kept speaking up. And that made the entire bit of legislation, the entire terrorism kind of regime, these excessive police powers, the excessive powers that the MI5 and MI6 have when it comes to, raiding your home or taking your technology or stopping you on the country's borders. All of these kind of powers became completely unenforceable. Now we have thousands and thousands of people speaking about Palestine Action, supporting Palestine Action, and they cannot deal with that. They weren't expecting that people were actually going to stand up and fight back.
And what can you tell us about Palestine Action? With the origin of the group, tell us much more about the Palestine Action.
So it started as a very kind of grassroots group in 2021, and it was basically just a very kind of a reaction to knowing that our government in the UK and our businesses in the UK have been an active participant in the continuous 70 plus years of continuous ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, as well as the continued apartheid in the occupied territories, as well as now the level of kind of complicity in the genocide, from our media to our government to financial institutions. There is so much which is just embedded into the British culture and British kind of public relations, which is actually aiding and abetting a genocide. When you have someone who has kind of witnessed this and seen that no one in power is brave enough to speak against it, people will start taking direct action rather than trying to go and write another petition or speak to your MP. And that's what Palestine Action was. There's a great metaphor about direct action as a concept, and it is that direct action isn't that you're thirsty and you beg your government to dig a well for you, but you go and dig that well for yourself and you see if they're going to stop you. And that's basically, it's taking action into your own hands. And the idea in Palestine Action was that if you create enough economic sabotage to a company which is actively killing people, and you create enough kind of whether it is property damage, whether you cause their insurance premiums to go up, whether you cause them to have more security on site, all of these things will basically make their own business unprofitable. So the more we can do that to businesses which are actively killing civilians and oppressing and implementing an apartheid, we can get rid of these businesses. Palestine Action managed to close down several Israeli weapons companies and weapons factories in the UK, which operate under complete protection from the UK government. So they managed, with this tactic of causing enough economic disruption to them, with kind of a multitude of different tactics, to shut down arms factories. Those have very direct impacts on the Palestinian people. It means that a set of drones, which would have been sent in to occupied Palestinian territories to kill civilians, did not get made. And that's the kind of beauty of direct action, is that it has a very clear impact in real life.
And maybe that's why it was so fiercely attacked by government. You spoke before about the use of the fear tactic, the use of the government using the fear tactic. How do you respond to that? I understand that your answer, or the answer of the group, the federal jury, was to go to the streets and face it, like these big demonstrations. Could you tell us a bit about your tactics?
So our tactics was basically the most simplest design. We came from a kind of Quaker background of just holding a sign silently, and bringing this kind of silent vigil type of protest into the public spaces. We used to be, before the prescription of Palestine Action, Defend Our Juries was used to be seen kind of a moderate group. Currently, in 2026, Defend Our Juries is the group with the highest rate of terrorism arrest in the entire history of the UK. So what the kind of tactic that we had was, it was really based on a very basic form of civil disobedience. So we saw an unjust law, the unjust law being the terrorism powers attached to support for Palestine Action. And that unjust law invites a breach. So we basically, with our right to freedom of expression and right to peaceful assembly, we empowered people to breach an unjust law by having a simple sign that said, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action. With those signs, it's called a Section 13 terrorism offense. It has a maximum sentence in prison of 6 months. And now there have been almost 3,000 arrests in the past 5 months for people holding those signs. The police could not arrest everyone. That was how big the movement was. The kind of prosecution of these individuals is completely chaotic. The entire kind of court system is falling apart because of these terrorism cases now being pushed through the courts. And it just shows how a very simple form of civil disobedience, just holding a sign, so it's very accessible. Anyone can do it. So anyone, if you want to, you could just hold this sign. It doesn't require you to climb up a building or break windows or anything. It's just you sitting silently with a sign. So it's extremely easy to do. And I think that's the kind of contrast that we created here, is that for the most peaceful way of protesting, which is the most kind of, historically as well, a kind of a beautiful show of this collective courage, a huge group of individuals with the same signs sitting quietly, and the counterterrorism police come and arrest you. Some of the arrests looked extremely scary. The police in specific cities were aggressive. And the kind of juxtaposition of these silent sign holders in contrast to police officers grabbing people and putting them in police cars just showed how insane the situation was, and how absolutely kind of a direct attack the terrorism powers were on our freedom of speech, on our civil liberties, on our human rights. And that's what really empowered more and more people to take part, because you can't just stand by and watch your civil liberties and everyone's human rights be trampled on in such manner.
Mm-hmm. And you also had an action in social media, because a great number of these prisons, these arrests, were videotaped or filmed, and you put that as a weapon against that. I'll just show a bit of one of the videos, and after you please comment about this other action that you had on the social media.
My sister, this is my sister. Can we go together because she has a cold Can we go together because she has a cold
So it was like a video arrest every day.
Yes. So because we had to wait for the kind of legal challenge of the prescription to come through from the courts, we've managed to show all of these cases on social media for a lot longer. And it's actually really interesting that putting a picture of one of these signs on social media under the terrorism legislation is another separate offense. So every single Instagram post from our group has now basically consisted of a terrorism offense. And that is what the kind of level of these powers looks like. It is a total silencing mechanism, and it is a total kind of draconian, authoritarian use of law. And we're extremely grateful that our High Court did rule that it was unlawful. So now I can openly speak about it without hopefully any risk legally.
So what happens now? Because there was this decision, but most of the people are still in prison, and I understand there will be another hearing this week.
Yes. So this Friday, so in 5 days' time, we will have another hearing where the High Court will either end the prescription of Palestine action, or they will continue it until the government appeals. The government has indicated that they will appeal the High Court decision, but what the ruling last Friday showed is that our High Court, which had 3 very senior kind of high-profile judges on this case, they already ruled that the order that Palestine action was prescribed with was unlawful, that our government should never have had this power to do so. And, you know, it is a really interesting read, but I wouldn't want to kind of give all of this credit to a high court as if we are kind of now agreeing that actually, yes, the law should be always listened to, whatever it is. We all knew that this was wrong. So it's great that the High Court has come to its senses and has realized that it was wrong. But I would like to kind of just preface that we didn't need the court to tell us. We knew it was wrong, and that's why we acted the way we did.
So what all those things tell us about democracy in United Kingdom? What's the definition of democracy in your country?
I think what we can say about democracy in this country is that it is not in a healthy way. The amount of corporate money that is in our politics is just getting higher and higher. There is a clear kind of split between the left and the right, but currently our government does not have any sort of moral tendencies in their actions. Everything seems to only highlight whatever the biggest corporation would want to happen. So I think democracy is at it's basically at the end of its life until we all act on it. I think the amount of impact that we have allowed big corporations and, you know, big Israeli corporations and big multinational corporations and big US corporations to have on the state of the politics in this country is really scary. And obviously social media and kind of the kind of overall media platforms also have an impact on this, and there is not a way that we could easily fix it instantly. But I think one of the kind of realizations that a lot of people in this country have had is that their own politicians, which they have voted in, will not vote on the interests of their own constituents. So the own people in their local area who voted them in to be in parliament. I think that trust is now gone. So I think a lot of people have recognized that whoever you vote in the kind of, you know, Labour or Conservative or Reform, those politicians will not vote what they promised to do when they were elected. And I think that is a big kind of issue when we have these kind of 4-year terms. So, you know, it's only been, you know, about, well, a year and a half since we got this government. And we've still got, you know, 2.5 years to go with this government. And that is a very long time to not be able to have an actual say in any of the votes that they do. And I've written to my own member of parliament several times. She now sends me a very blanket response. I write to her about the issue in Palestine. I've written to her about the issue in the genocide going on in Sudan. I've written to her about the use of AI or Palantir being given big contracts in our health services. I've written to her about all of these kind of cases, and what I now get back is just a blanket response of thank you for getting in touch with me. There are so many emails that I will just read them, but I will not actually respond. And what I see her doing in Parliament is, nothing other than listening to her own party leaders who are basically telling her, well, we're obviously supporting Israel blindly. We will obviously continue spending money on military. We'll obviously continue spending money on oil. And whatever happens in Palestine isn't, our issue, but we'll still continue arming Israel. So that's the kind of, I think, the realization of a lot of people currently is that, yes, you may be voted for someone, but after that, you have no say. And I think that is something that is really now driving people a little bit insane, that they see this kind of, as if democracy only happens once every 4 years. So only that one time when you go and cast your vote, that's democracy, and rest is nothing. But we need to come to the realization that democracy needs to happen all the time, and that we need to be able to protest, and those protests need to be able to have an impact rather than just kind of the being ignored in the media, being ignored by our politicians. If there are continuous protests, there is a reason why those protests are taking place. It is because people haven't been heard. And that's basically what happened with both Palestine Action. It happened with Defend Our Juries. We have to keep coming back, month after month. And the more you have to do that, the more tired and desperate people will be. And that's not a healthy way to approach democracy either, when you feel that you've never been heard.
And is it possible that all this situation gives birth to, say, a third force in the political scene, besides conservatives and labor? And what about disruptive voices in the present parliament?
So I think it's definitely now given a complete kind of third and fourth and maybe even fifth force in politics. Labour and Conservatives are both now quite hated as political parties, and the Greens, which are obviously a very left party, now have the highest support they've ever had. But equally, we have a far right party, Reform, which are equally popular. And Greens and Reform have this, it is polarized, and it is really sad that that's the way that the kind of current system has pushed us to. But I think it really shows that people weren't happy with what those kind of middle ground parties were proposing. And that's where we're going now, is that we will have more parties. We will have, hopefully, if these kind of parties get to actually somehow even work together, we would have a more a government with more differing opinions, and those opinions would be listened to. And that way also, we know that not everyone in this country wants the exact same things on every topic. So that's completely natural. So I think it is quite, disconcerting that would be the way that our government and parliament would work, that there are no dissenting voices. So I am hoping that the way that kind of politics is currently working is that we would get to a change in the system where it's not just two big parties, but there are more individual, smaller groups, as well as a different mechanism for normal people to affect decision making throughout that 4-year period. So there's different kind of proposals from different like grassroots organizations, such as citizens' assemblies is one where citizens come together and deliberate, and it would be kind of a random group of people elected for a time, and then the random group would change. So those kinds of different mechanisms are being looked at, but it is difficult to try and get the people in power to let go of their power. So I think that's what we're gonna face next, is the people in power will not want to create another system that would disseminate that power to kind of everyday people.
And what can you tell us about the influence of this movement in other countries in Europe? We have seen in the last decade or more, the far right is growing. You can tell us about the influence of this kind of movement in other countries?
I think the kind of scary parts of this is that you find so much information and false information online. So there is a lot of anger that people get motivated by. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be angry about things. I'm angry about many things, but to be motivated only based on anger, which is also based on falsehoods, I think that's where we have kind of a dangerous breeding ground of violence and of hatred towards our neighbors. So I think what the biggest problem that I've seen is really the kind of big tech and big kind of media corporations weaponizing that anger and weaponizing it even more by creating stories about, particularly, I think in Europe, the big kind of anger stories are always it's either about trans people or it's about refugees. So those two groups, who are extremely vulnerable groups now, have basically gotten a huge part of just kind of anger towards them, where what it really is, it's a distraction from everything else. It's a distraction of what again, kind of the corruption in our government is doing. That corruption in our government, as long as no one's paying attention to it, it can continue going, and it can continue making profits for the arms industry, for the oil and gas industry. So that is kind of what we've seen both in the rest of Europe as well as the UK, is that if we keep people distracted, let's get them distracted with a refugee issue, and that way no one's going to know that we're giving billions of pounds in contracts to an Israeli weapons company, or that we're making big deals with a big US tech firm to hand over data. So I think that's really the bigger issues in Europe and the UK.
Mm-hmm. And how to educate people about that? Because I mean, the big techs have the control of mass media, and what the opposition have, or I mean, what all these grassroots group have. How do they work to change the tables?
It's a really good question. I think one is the use of kind of independent media, and I do think that independent media, it has a huge power to kind of create positive change. The other is just organizing in communities. So as Defend Our Juries, we want to have kind of local community groups, and our local community groups, they meet in person, they organize within their local areas, they speak to their neighbors, they speak to people in that area, and try and create those human interactions. The more we kind of end up only organizing online, the more susceptible we will be to any kind of, for example, on TikTok, Defend Our Juries has completely been shadow banned. So we don't, we get barely 100 views on a video where in the beginning when we started posting, it was easily 1 million views. And then suddenly, because it was about Palestine, it got banned and no one now sees them. So we're basically, if we kind of put all of our eggs in the basket of social media and bigger kind of tech companies, if we fall to the kind of the dark side of the algorithm, that means you don't get to reach your audience. That means you don't get to reach your supporters, and someone else will reach them. And I think that's why we know that the importance of community organizing, the importance of just being able to speak to people in real life is so important.
And written, I mean, booklets, pamphlets.
Yes, so we do have we
Newspaper.
have leaflets. Yeah, we have leaflets. We have lots of kind of I guess it's it comes under like exhibition kind of work, where we would have there are these like big boards. We call it timeline of corruption and timeline of a genocide. And those boards, they're kind of human-sized boards, and we take them to different places for the public to see and to have this kind of, the story in front of you. It's not on a screen, and it is not something that you can just, you could just walk past it, but it's something that is visual and interactive, and you get to speak to people. And that is something that we find a lot more powerful in a lot of cases. And obviously, in the case of our kind of silent vigils, we generally, don't do so-called like outreach, but we will have different kinds of people coming and like supporting. And I think currently what we've seen is that it's not just defend our juries when we go out and when we sit with signs. Defend our juries individuals, we will have our own signs, and our signs will be the ones that we've kind of as a movement agreed to. But there will be hundreds of other organizations and groups, and they will have their own banners. And it's this beautiful puzzle coming together of different groups from different backgrounds. Some are trade unions, some are, there's, Parents for Palestine, or kind of different groups that work on more of the legal side of kind of issues, whether it's Greenpeace or Amnesty International. We have different organizations coming together, and we found a really beautiful way of giving space to everyone. And I think that's also really important when we're organizing, is that we're not kind of we don't want to say this is our sign and no one else can use it, and this is our protest and no one else can come and support. We want to make sure that everyone can do what they want. If you want to join us, this is how we would like it to be, but just join. And that's the primary thing. And our kind of, it's not really a motto, but a slogan that we've had from the very beginning, when 3 years ago we started as a campaign, was unity, not uniformity. And it basically just highlights that we don't all have to agree on everything or look the same or act the exact same way. But if we come together and unite, that's the most powerful thing.
Okay, and what can you tell us about your personal experience participating in these demonstrations?
So I think the beautiful thing was being there with everyone else, having a few hundred people with me, knowing that whatever was going to happen, I wasn't there alone. The kind of, I ended up sitting, it was end of November when I last got arrested with a sign, and it was ice cold. I don't even have a hat or gloves in that picture. I did get hat and gloves given to me later on by someone because I just wasn't dressed properly. And, you know, I was given a foil blanket, I was given food and snacks, and people kept bringing me warm drinks. I ended up sitting there for 8 hours before the police finally arrested me, because it took them so long to arrest everyone. And I think the police were also kind of hoping that because it was so cold, we were all just going to go home and they didn't have to arrest people under terrorism. So there was just this beautiful moment of knowing that I am being looked after, and I am part of a community where people look after each other, and people, you know, don't want any harm to happen to anyone, whether they would disagree with me or not. And I think that was the kind of most powerful thing about taking part in these sign holdings. And since then, I was released from custody the next day, and the police were, you know, I'm not one to kind of be a fan of police generally, but the police were extremely nice to me, and they were a little bit embarrassed that I was in police custody for holding a piece of cardboard. You know, I had my DNA and fingerprints taken, and I was released the next kind of early morning hours. And since then, I've been released from under bail conditions. So I used to have bail conditions not to organize protests, but that was now lifted. So now I'm just under investigation by the police, and I'm waiting if they would go ahead with any other action. Because of the High Court ruling last Friday, and that saying that the entire terrorism legislation against Palestine Action was unlawful, it is possible that everyone, all of the almost 3,000 people getting arrested with these signs, we could be given compensation for unlawful arrest. It's still in the kind of early days of that, and we are kind of seeking legal advice on it from specialized lawyers in these kind of cases. But currently our priority is looking after each other, looking after everyone who was arrested, making sure that anyone who was arrested has the kind of right people around them. There are individuals who have been asked to leave their jobs. There's quite a few doctors who've been kind of put under investigation as a doctor for holding a sign. And there's been different individuals with different kind of consequences. So now our priority is looking after everyone who took part. And that's what we're prioritizing.
And what about the people that were members of the Palestinian Action? There were a group that was arrested before all these demonstrations, and some of them entered in a hunger strike. Some of them stayed on a hunger strike for more than 2 months. What can you tell us about them? They ended the hunger strike with a victory, they say, but what can you tell us about them?
So there's still 27 people in prison from Palestine Action and other kind of Palestine-related protest who they ended their hunger strike. So 8 of them were on hunger strike. And although they ended their hunger strikes after about, it was around 2.5 months, which is an insanely long time, and it was extremely dangerous to be on hunger strike for that long. They haven't recovered fully, so they are in recovery, but the kind of ability to fully recover whilst you're in prison, whilst you're shackled to a hospital bed, is quite difficult. And there are still individuals that we really need to keep focused on during this process of recovery. All of the hunger strikers will have different levels of permanent damage from the hunger strike, but they did end up winning a lot of the demands that they had. One of the main demands, which was around the censorship that the prisoners were under, they weren't receiving their own mail. For example, they had books taken away, so they couldn't even read in prison. They weren't allowed to interact with other prisoners in case of kind of telling them about Palestine. So there are cases of, for example, one of the prisoners wasn't allowed to read about feminism. So feminist books were taken away from her. And these kind of stories, which were part of the reason they stepped into the struggle of a hunger strike, they actually ended up winning a lot of these demands. And for example, a lot of the censorship did end, and they received up to 6 months of letters from the public and their family members and their friends that were sent to prison, and they finally got to read them. I'm sure that there are still lots of letters that they weren't given. I am sure that they didn't give everything to them. But that is just a kind of part of it. And one of the biggest demands that they had, which was to shut Elbit Systems down, which is Elbit is the biggest Israeli military contractor and their weapons manufacturer. Elbit was in the bid of getting a £2 billion contract with the Ministry of Defence in the UK. And that contract actually fell through during the hunger strike. And we needed to take that as a win, because that is a beautiful moment when Elbit Systems actually does not get what they want, which is a huge defense contract. And I would like to just highlight that the word defense there is a little bit misplaced, because Elbit Systems and defense do not go hand in hand. They are offensive weapons, and they are offensive weapons specifically used against civilian populations. And I think that is something that we need to make sure that the public understand, that it's not something that now that a defense contract didn't get through with Elbit, that the defense systems of the UK would be under threat. That is not at all what's happened. But what happened is that £2 billion of UK taxpayer money did not go to an Israeli weapons manufacturer. And that is a win. And we can credit the hunger strikers for that and their bravery.
Great. Lex, would like to thank you very much for your time, for giving us so much valuable information. And I'll speak a little bit in Portuguese now, para agradecer também a todos que estão conosco agora, acompanhando essa entrevista ao vivo, e a todos que nos visitam a qualquer momento aqui na internet. A gente convida vocês para que se inscrevam no nosso canal e cliquem na sinetinha para receber avisos de novos vídeos, e também participem do grupo Amigos do Tutameia. O link de convite para esse grupo está disponível na descrição desse vídeo. E agora a gente volta a palavra para a nossa entrevistada para o fechamento da entrevista. Now, Lex, before we say goodbye, we'd like to hear your message for the Brazilian people, and also if you can say a bit about the next moves of the movement pro-Palestine in UK.
Great. Firstly, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for hearing about Defend Our Juries and the struggle in the UK. I think the overall message that I would like to give to everyone everywhere in the world is that we should not be afraid to speak up. We should not be afraid to unite as people. And the more we can show that the people can win against corporations, and the people can win against corporations in bed with our own states and in our governments, the more we can win for humanity and the more peace we can bring. So I think that's my kind of final message. We are in the workings of what's going to happen next after a huge win for the pro-Palestinian movement in the UK. But you can find us online. Our website is defendourjuries.net, as well as social media is always Defend Our Juries. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Tchau, pessoal.